Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Hayes Hall and the School of Architecture and Planning. I'm Bob Shibley, the Dean of the School of Architecture and Planning, and I am proud to be a member of this faculty, staff, and student body. It's a heady time to be in Buffalo. It's a terrific time to be at the university at Buffalo. I extend welcome to our provost, Chip Zukowski, who's joined us this evening. Thank you, Chip. We are here this evening at the Sidney Gross Memorial Lecture offered by Shohei Shigematsu. I want to say just a little bit about Sidney first. Tonight's lecture is named in memory of Sidney Gross, a former student of the School of Architecture and Planning. Sidney died in a car accident in 2009, shortly after her freshman year. But she did not leave without making a significant mark on our student body, on our faculty, and in the continuing life of the school. Chris Romano was a member of the faculty who taught first-year design studios and remembers Sidney as Sidney was not only a brilliant designer, but possessed a radiance and energy that spread like wildfire through the studios of Parker Hall and into everyone around her. I'm reminded of the notion of why we teach, which is not to fill buckets, but to ignite fires. And that Sidney brought a fire to her work. Sidney's family, led by her mother, Lori Duckstein, who's with us this evening. Lori, thanks for joining us. Established an endowed fund to memorialize Sidney and support student life in the school. A student lounge on the second floor is named in Sidney's honor. So is this annual lecture, which is meant to cultivate the type of energy and thought-provoking discourse that Sidney was able to inspire within us all. She's the very definition of the fires we choose to ignite. So for our lecture this evening, we are pleased to bring Shohei Shigematsu. He's a partner at OMA. He joined the firm in 1988 and led the office in New York since 2006. He's older than he looks, by the way. He's currently design architect for AK360, the Albright-Knox Gallery's $100 million campus expansion and refurbishing, one of the most important additions to Buffalo's cultural and urban landscapes in decades. I say that being cautious and very proud of our own Hayes Hall, but I'll get past it. Show's designs for cultural venues include the Quebec National Museum and the Fine Arts Center in Miami Beach, as well as direct collaborations with artists, including Mariana Abramovitz and Kanye West. Show is currently designing a number of luxury high-rise towers in San Francisco, New York, and Miami, as well as a mixed-use complex in Santa Monica. His engagement with urban conditions around the world include a new civic center in Bogata, Colombia, a post-Hurricane Sandy urban water strategy for New Jersey, and a food hub in Louisville, Kentucky. Just absorb that range for a minute. And then ask yourself about the broad scope of relevance that architecture represents. And as a dean in architecture and planning, I would say architecture and planning represent. Shohei is a design critic at Harvard Graduate School of Design, where he is conducting a research studio entitled Elementary Design. We do a lot with our med school. I kind of like that connection. But what he's investigating is the intersection of food, architecture, and urbanism. And that's not a comment on how many of our graduates become chefs. I present to you Shohei.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. Exactly 5 years ago, I gave a lecture here. The condition in our office, and I guess a little bit of Buffalo, was quite different then. In 5 years, many things has happened, especially in our office. But now that I'm more and more engaged into Buffalo community, I also feel a much stronger momentum at Buffalo now than then. And I'm very happy that I'm part of this community. And thank you for accommodating us. And our team is also sitting at the back. So we are looking forward to have more further exchanges with you using the opportunity of dealing with Albright-Knox extension, which is, as it was described, probably one of the most important cultural projects to come in this city. I have many slides, so when you feel dizzy, please let me know. Of course, we always try to look into the specifics of the city or the university we give a lecture. Did you know this? It's a bit kind of cynical, but 10 cities that are about to be famous again, Buffalo. Your upgrade on public space is remarkable. Even the travel and kind of leisure is kind of picking up Buffalo. And this is a top 10 city for millennial home buyers, 7th Buffalo. So the quality of life here and the younger generation who are looking at those are picking this city. I don't know what Albany is on 8th, but so you can see that the younger generation is actually kind of coming into this city, creating new culture, increasing, again, millennial jobs, Buffalo, and also different companies making difference. And I guess also the university is trying to address the resiliency or the sustainability aspect that you are part of a bigger water system and green system. Now I go into our firm. I was in several lectures recently, and in the introduction, the dean was trying to be nice to me and ask students, oh, you know the firm OMA, how many people do you have this book? How many people have this book? And expecting that many will raise their hands, but recently I encountered many occasions that like only 10 students raised their hand. So this kind of course, my mentor Rem Koolhaas's writing was almost 20 years ago. So OMA's brand is now becoming too established. That's why I'm trying to change that culture as a kind of outpost of the firm in New York. So this is just the kind of old dictionary size. The firm, as you might know, is divided into two. One that deals with architecture, OMA, and AMO, which is a think tank that deals with speed of the current society. As you might know, OMA was very famous, is still very famous for spawning very successful firms. As you might know, big other firms here. And these are my generation, and that's a little bit before. But anyway, OMA is such a kind of studio-like or machine-like to teach a methodology that can be used in the future for your practice. So it spawned, also it was a very kind of nasty working environment, so a lot of people just left and made their new office. So that's how it worked, creating a kind of successful outpost. And then these are the work, you might say it's still in the grain of similarity or something very different. Anyway, they're very successful offices coming out, and there are some similarities. We're just showing our copyright being used by other spin-offs. You can see that you have to check the ears. Anyway. But what's changing now is that the firm is kind of becoming a bit more adult and containing this kind of outpost within the firm. So represented, for example, the New York office. We have a comfortable distance to Europe. And when we opened the firm, when I took over the firm, it was like 2006 or 2007, where the crisis was already kind of being hit. So no one was really interested in US, so I had a kind of complete freedom to rebuild the brand of OMA. So now, since then, I started with 5 people, now we have about 80. But anyway, the point is that the OMA is now becoming a multifaceted company, not headed by a single architect, but headed by different offices and partners. I would like to describe my lecture through changes, because what I learned the most in OMA and through REM is to capture the change and then use that for architectural intervention. Because when you capture the moment of change, you can always try to reinvent the architecture or the condition in favor of architecture and urbanism. First change. The REM is my father's age, born in 44. I was born in 73. What happened in my particular time is that this is a GDP decline of Japan, marked by 3 big kind of economic crises. This is an overlay of my key moments in life to that crisis map. So you can see that my kind of key moments of my life perfectly coincided with big kind of economic crises. So somehow I was doomed to live with a crisis as a Japanese. So I was really interested in what it means to be a recession as an architect, because as I showed for Rem and me, I think the earlier generation and my father's generation always lived with modernization and always booming. You knew that the next day was better. But in my generation, especially in Japan, it was the opposite. So I was always struggling with that discrepancy, and especially after studying architecture and urbanism, what does it mean to, I was always thinking what it means to be an architect when there's declining and there's no architectural drive. So I did the studio at Harvard called Post-Crisis. So anyway, the point is that when the index of economy goes down, actually the index of human, basically human index such as planning, connecting, thinking actually goes up. So one of the typologies that gets built the most in the recession is church. A lot of inventions are actually made during the time of recession. And a lot of good, famous, or acknowledged writing of architecture and urbanism were written during the recession, which is easy to imagine. As you can imagine, when architects don't have work, they have time to write. In Japan, for me, the economy actually reflects on design. So this is a metabolist work in Japan. It's a Japanese avant-garde in 50s and 60s. You can see the sense of gravity, sense of material, sense of edge, etc. After 20 years, this is a kind of well, not more than 20, 30 years of recession. This is a kind of mainstream Japanese architecture in the radical side. There's no sense of edge, there's no sense of material, there's no sense of color. So somehow a lot of people think this is a Japanese minimalism, but I personally think this is somehow affected by the long-lasting recession. So what I was trying to say as a change is that it used to be coupled very easily in people's mind. Upturn and modernization was coupled. Downturn and demodernization, doing nothing, was coupled. But now these things are happening everywhere in this upturn but demodernization, but downturn but modernization. So we, as our generation, has to deal with much more complex condition. Change 2. This is, as you know, one of the most visited entity or the place now in New York, High Line. Since then, a lot of municipality wants something like High Line, the green infrastructure. So this was a bridge that Heatherwick was planning in London, which sounds like it's in the danger of not happening. Even architecture started to pick up on the kind of bridge trend. That's a joke, but anyway. I was a little bit alarmed by the hype of High Line as an architect because, well, this is Scofidio, who was one of the designer of the High Line, saying it's not architecture, but it's a landscape. But if you look at the recession time when I just took over New York, during the recession, architects could never win urban competitions anymore because architects has to rely on building something, but landscape designers can actually upgrade the urban condition without building. So of course, what used to be led by architects, now landscape designers are actually leading a lot of big urban interventions. Anyway, so then this competition came, which we luckily won. It's a bridge in DC between Anacostia and the proper DC side that connects two different economical grades. So this is a bit more abandoned and low-income community, and the kind of up-and-coming waterfront area. But using the existing bridge piers, basically to build the park as well as the bridge. Typically the bridge is kind of slowly going up to have a clearance for the ships or whatever to go under. In here we just kept it going, so to create an X. So that X creates a kind of symbolic plaza in the intersection of two planes. That creates one, you're coming from one side creating a gateway, and then you can actually ascend higher at the vantage point where there's a kind of symbolic plaza in the center, and then a higher point where you can actually look over to the DC or to the Anacostia side. There's a lot of water activities happening, so this is a kind of part of the competition, so we are kind of legitimizing our design desperately. And then this is the, also by having X, you can actually, this is a kind of heat map. Bridge tends to be very hot, as you know, exposure to the sun, so it gives some shading. Structurally, actually, it also makes sense. It actually is hanging the bottom to reduce the load to the existing piers below. Iconically, also, X, we thought it was very appealing in DC because you know the L'Enfant's plan, which is not a straight grid, but it's a very skewed grid. But every highlight, every famous building in DC is actually at the intersection of this X. So for us, it was almost like putting the X into the vertical position. So we thought, we could be a highlight of DC, but you can see how not so competitive to the other monuments. These are just trying to say that it's like a kind of Rialto, but it's kind of X. And then having different program. This is a water infiltration embedded at the base, so you can show that cleaning of the water process as a waterfall. And the cafe that looks into it. We are trying to project the history of Anacostia. There are a lot of storytellers telling the history of Anacostia, so to try to be reflecting the community. Again, cafe, performance space, Air Force One. We thought that we could actually be strong in iconic, or we can start to compete with other buildings because it's X. So we can actually thought we can use the $10 to have a X. Anyway, sorry, I have a lot of jokes. So. This is the, so we are doing a lot of public space upgrade. This is the post-Sandy master plan. In Hoboken. Hoboken actually used to be an island, so where you see green is where the water came in the Sandy, so it became a real island isolated by the water. Now we are basically upgrading the whole public domain, which is simultaneously water barriers. Toronto, which is a city that is close to you, we are doing a new city center, 10 million square feet of new office. That's downtown. That's in the east side at the Don River mouth, which is a transit-oriented development. So we will make a new transit hub here, which is simultaneously a bridge to go over the water from this distillery district and Pan Am game area to go across and then create a hub, and then to plan new city entirely around that transit hub, which was just announced. So we are doing a lot of urban interventions. This is Bogota's new government district. All the rich people used to live on the hill. This is a kind of paradigm shift for them to plan a new government district in the flat land. We connected the Central Park to the National University with a green, car-free public space, and then defined a new government center which has a symmetrical and monumental frontage, which is now implemented and being built. Now I would like to talk about the Cornell. Cornell was architecture, art, and planning faculty addition. It was rare that we were the third architect to be doing the same design. So first Stephen Hall won the competition, second Barco and Leibinger got it, and then we were the third one because the first two failed. Typically we are the first one and then someone takes over, but we were lucky to be the third one. This is a condition when we came. The architecture, art, and planning were housed in different wings in different buildings, so they didn't really talk to each other, and they even hated each other. And it was also isolated from the art squad. They had this kind of northern campus which overlooks the gorge, but they didn't really capitalize on that potential. Anyway, it was a lot of problem like this. So what we did is to define a building that is entirely based on an existing buildings line and make almost like a mini art squad that is simultaneously a bridge that connects three buildings, but to provide a very flexible space for the art and architecture education. And which was spanning over 48 feet cantilever. So now this is a real picture. So there's a bus stop and it goes over the existing road. In order to achieve this cantilever, we had to have trusses. If you provide a Virendale truss, the straight columns, then it will be very expensive and heavy. If you provide a most conventional truss, there are a lot of head height issues. So we actually analyzed more the circulation and program, as well as the moments, the actual stress pattern of the building, and then came up with more hybridized truss where there's a more circulation and less moment. We kept the Virendale and it gradually became a truss. So the students can actually see this form and learn where the stress is happening in the building. So you can see the kind of traveling truss. Again, straight to truss. Students are pretty good in, of course, using the space. This guy invented the hammock immediately. And then maybe it's his here. I mean, even like capitalizing the shelf. And then, yes, like, I don't know if this is an installation or actual domestication. Playing. Ensuring the future flexibility, we put all the infrastructure on the ceiling. So chilled beam, all the air circulation, data, electricity, all is in the ceiling so that the floor is just radiant heating floor. So in the future, if you want to change the layout of the studio, etc., it's always very flexible. So you can see the contrast, very high-tech ceiling versus very basic floor. It's like a lab construction. Anyway, and then there's another element that is like a landscape-like, which is a concrete dome that intersects to the upper plate and then providing an access to above, which is more like a landscape element. So we provided a bit more unpredictable spaces in between the upper plate and the ground, which was in contrast to the steel construction. It was a very, of course, heavy-handed concrete construction that we had to cast in one night, overnight, because it was one shot and used like 5 different the concrete cars, and then attracted, and this kind of space is attracting urban activities in the campus, which didn't happen before, or this kind of exterior covered space. There's an auditorium on top of this mound, which is accessible from the studio here down. So people are going down to the auditorium from their studio. It's like on top of a mound like this, which has a panoramic view with acoustic glass, so you don't hear anything, but you have a view because you're already And it preserves certain darkness already because there's a cover above. So you can have a lecture without closing the curtain, and also you can see still like buses and cars and people going around, but so you see the urban activity, but you have an open auditorium. This is Howard Milstein, the main donor. He liked this auditorium so much that he also wanted to use this as a boardroom for the entire university, but he decided that while the construction was going, so it had to be retrofitted. This was a boardroom that they were using in Cornell. It was, this kind of long thing that is hard to go out. So we looked at the kind of types of chairs, and of course the board members need to be recognized. So we came up with kind of individual swivel chairs, like a business class chairs that has a voting system, etc., and built in like this. But the problem is that this board meeting only happens twice a year. And you don't want to have permanent installation because this is for students basically, and you don't want to have off-site storage to bring in the furniture each time. So what we came up with, so these are the kind of configurable thing. What we came up with a system that actually you can electrically store the chairs into the floor. So we thought it's actually quite interesting that like a zombie of board members, actually twice a year, actually they come out and then form the board meeting. So you can see. So this was retrofit. Under the dome is a crit space, have a bridge to overlook down. So you can see this is a really nice picture. These are, because there's a bus stop, a lot of people are actually coming here, non-architectural crowd, looking down to the activity that is happening in architecture and art school. And then if you are an observer in the school, you can also look down to the crit from above. There's a flexible wall here that allows you to segregate or divide and have simultaneous crit like this, or exhibition, or room even. And this was an art installation. So there are a lot of activities happening in this dome. We even designed the bathroom. This was a continuous ribbon of stainless steel that intersects between men and women. So you're always actually in the bathroom next to a different gender. So it keeps certain tension. But now, as you know, the issue of bathrooms with the gender issue, this is not even, we have to rethink the men and women separation. But this was also, the signage was deliberately kind of kept it vague, XY, man, XX as women, so that you don't really know which way to go. So it's full height, so you don't hear the sound of next door. This is I don't show you all, but this is, actually, I don't know why the sound is not coming out here. I think, it's this, right? Actually, without it. This is a student film, the 78 hours. As you know, the architecture school is a hard-working environment, so 78 hours they filmed and then made a movie which got an award. it's a one space for all the students, so you actually see all the activities of your co-workers or co-students. So it's I think it's quite a unique environment, and you see the existing buildings around. So this is facing the Sibley Hall, the library side. So that was existing buildings facade. Anyway, I have a lot to show, so I will skip. The National Museum. So it's actually quite similar to Albright-Knox. The existing museum was in the Battlefields Park where French and English fought. As you can see, Quebec City is divided by a big park and a city. The museum for the first time bought a site that faces the main boulevard of the city next to an existing church. When I give a lecture, a lot of people say after, oh, how do you decide that scheme was the best? And do you come up with that very fast because you're so clear in explaining? But of course, it's not like that. So I want to show you what kind of studies we were doing. This is, again, extension from the existing museum. This is a church. This is a boulevard. This is a scheme that is like an ant farm. One big wall where it's multi-story, so you can actually see the movement of the people like wall. This is a 2-tower. This is an internal communication updating the team that sending updates to the leaders. So we test with models and views. This was a scheme that focuses on the skylight. Because it's multi-story gallery, we wanted to bring the natural light down, so there are more like this kind of valley-like condition above, so to bring more natural light. This was one of the nice schemes. It's a triangle, so we thought that we could bring people directly to the park, not to the museum, and then create an interesting tension between the church. But triangular plan, as you know, it's a bit difficult plan to deal with, and also the form looked a bit like a Dutch cheese, so we thought it was too obvious. So after that, we decided we like this kind of story and narrative. It's an extension of a museum, but because the site was at the point where city and park meets, we thought it was nice to for 3 entities to be involved. So not just art that extends, but the city and park, both 3 entities extends at the same time, and art becomes a catalyst between the city and the park. So it was, as you can see, the topography actually continues over, and the city activity comes under. And 3 gallery box, temporary, permanent, or design and contemporary, and Inuit and design. This is how it is now. So you see the landscape going over and the city coming in, and we kept it low, as high as this lower part of the church, so that the church becomes the symbol of the museum, because the museum is thinking to use the church in the future, also part of the museum. The frontage. This is the Grand Hall. The Canada, the funding of the museum is half sustained by the government, but half they have to make their own revenue. So the museum is actually used almost like an event space. So we were charged to actually create a column-free space on the ground, which almost like an extension of the street, surrounded by different programs, but they do a lot of events here. So this is a view back to the city from that Grand Hall, looking towards park. And then looking towards the church side, there's a smaller presbytery portion that intersects the Grand Hall, which we made an abstract concrete wall, and then the ticketing and the code check. So you have the history on one side, park on the other, and then the current city. So I'm just being proud of. He will appear a couple of times, so please bear with me. Opening, parties. The circulation is organized with a different program. This is a main stair. Because some people are coming from the tunnel, from the existing complex, we basically create an atrium that is almost like a kind of spinning wheel, so that people coming from the street and people coming from the existing complex is meeting here and basically either going up or down. Again, JT. This stair is quite it's kind of convenient lately to actually investigate the post-occupancy of your building through Instagram. So, but of course we chose only kind of beautiful ladies. This is a tunnel that connects the existing building to the underground. So we basically offsetted the roundabout. So you know, even though you're underground, you know exactly where you're passing. So this is a tunnel. And also we made the end of the tunnel a gallery dedicated to one artwork. So this is the kind of tunnel with curve. And then this is a Rio Pel gallery. This triptych was so long that it could never fit to existing gallery in the one sightline. So we used the length to, for the first time, to have a sightline to see three long mural in one go. And there they do a lot of kind of events also. We also framed in the galleries to have sense of orientation to the existing complex. A lot of windows, view to the landscape, a roof. So it captures the, and then this is a so-called stair window where you come out of the volume once and then go one level higher. So it's simultaneously a window, but it's also a stair. So you're immersed with green and park when you're going up and down, and you're a little bit liberated from the fatigue of viewing art. Again, Justin. And then post-occupancy. Facade is 3 layers of glass, having some having frit, one having textured glass, all 3 different glass that has a depth, creating depth, and echoing the structure behind. So it's almost like an inverse shadow of the structure behind. So you see the kind of ghost of the structure, but it's all frit. It captures the light in a kind of interesting way. Sorry, probably the last time. And then in the galleries also, they do a lot of events. You can see the facade changing with a different time of the day. And then obviously very intense winter. There's a courtyard between the church and the museum. This is another building in Miami Beach we just finished. This is a guy called Alan Faena. He's a businessman, developer, but he used to be a fashion designer, but he reused this existing abandoned silo in Puerto Madero in Buenos Aires. And then it was only this building when he converted this hotel into a Philip Stark design hotel. After that, you can see other developers came here and then built a new development, because basically this is at this moment the highest real estate in Buenos Aires, thanks to him. So but he's not a typical developer. He of course does hotel and living, but also invests a lot on culture. So with that method, he came to Miami Beach, in the center of Miami Beach Peninsula, somewhere here. Our site was 3 sites, where the creek, the salt water, the big public beach and more private creek side was very close to each other. We came up through urbanism of like having a Collins, which is the main boulevard of Miami Beach, and the creek side, and then providing like 4 equal volume rather than 1 big volume here and 2 smaller ones. and then created a literal center because it's very difficult for people to cross this road because it's high traffic road, and also the beach is basically this side, so no one actually goes to this side. But we had to do a cultural center here, so we made a kind of round shape to provide more public space around. That resonates the Miami Beach modernism to some degree, but also this kind of interesting juxtaposition of two different volumes meeting, but have very different section, like one is dome and classical and one is a black box. In plan also one is round and one is square or rectangle. So this is a dome. With the Oculus you can actually put the cars from the crane. You can use this as a loading hall too. And all the infrastructure is in this dome. And then you are seeing the black box here. Yeah. And then there's a mezzanine that you can actually overlook. So this is the first installation we did for the opening. But you can also separate the two and then to your opening rather than separating. But you can separate these two and have two events simultaneously. This side is having a big view to the creek. And then there's a third space, which is a lobby, which is also event space. So, you know, art space nowadays have to provide quite a diversity. And also Miami Beach, as you know, is a home for Art Basel in December. So there are many events that they have to cater. So it's almost like an event machine. We wanted to create a dramatic arrival, and also for the water table issue, we brought the level. We brought the lobby into a higher level, second level. So we cut the cylinder and let the landscape slide under and have a water feature. In order to do this cantilever, we use the skin as a structure. So it's a kind of a shell structure. So all the structure is in the facade. So we tested many ways, but in the end we decided to go with series of arches that looks like almost like a palm tree or organic shell, which we thought it was appropriate for Miami Beach. And that's the kind of structure. So you can see how close it is to the beach, which is a kind of interesting scene because cultural building never, in my opinion, in my experience, is so close to kind of leisure. This is that's the interesting thing about Miami Beach now, that how it's transforming from a resort city to actual living city. So as the opening, you see the big window here. And then circulation is at the perimeter. And then already after, like almost like 4 months after the opening, they're using it, of course, in a very different way. This was the gala, Madonna's concert, art installation, etc. And just some postdocs. There are almost 400 different window types, so we basically made a mold and then put in between the rebars, almost like a mold, yeah. And then we took them out after they cast the concrete. This is a parking garage, mechanical parking, that we had to provide 50% opening, natural ventilation. So we use this perforation, angled hole, so that it's angled so you capture this light in an interesting way than the straight perforation. So it's almost like a tropical facade for cars, ironically, not for a human being. And we expose the car elevators at the side so you can see your expensive cars coming or going. Next to a people's elevator, there's a restaurant at the top, so you see the movement of people and the cars. This was under construction moment, and a lot of people loved this point where there was no internal wall and had a fenestration visible from the main area. So when we were asked to design a stage set for the inaugurational performance with Pam Tanovitz, which is a new and up-and-coming choreographer in New York, we decided to bring back the state of this virtually. So we calculated the opening day's sunlight movement, and then basically calculated the sun and the shadow pattern that is as if there was no internal wall, and then basically project mapped the movement of the sun onto the stage, which was a huge disc where people can sit in the stage. So you can see. So the idea was that you could see the movement of the sun as if there was no internal wall, and the people, dancers, and time and light is all moving. This is an interesting part which I wanted to get to.
Rise of design.
Sorry, I'll go back one. So it's about the creative economy. I think the design now is, as you know, used as a word in many of the business scene. A lot of business schools are actually using design as a part of methodology to think and overcome problems. But I think the design, as you know, design is a little bit different from design thinking. I like the way that design is actually expanding its territory, but now it's a little bit overused, and I think that's dangerous. This is a question and answer from Eames, in 70s. Just shut up.
Rise of design.
What are the boundaries of problems?
Is design a creation of a group?
Very often.
Is there a design ethic?
There are always design constraints, and these often imply an ethic.
Is it a method of general expression?
No, it is a method of action.
Anyway, I think the creative economy is an interesting area to look at. Nowadays, you can monetize creative economy. As you know, it's $630 billion. And within that, 60% is a design-oriented business. As you know, like a D school
are able to adapt
in Stanford is capitalizing on that. They're merging the design thinking to the business thinking, like the IDEO method.
Consumer to define a problem.
This is a side story, but since the D school was made, the Post-it actually sales exponentially went up. And even the art installation of Post-it. The creative city is a kind of interesting representation also how the word creative or design is becoming obsolete. So there are 116 UNESCO Creative City Network. It's a title you can get when you apply to UNESCO. There are different categories, crafts, folk art, city of literature, city of design, city of music, etc. There are 116. If you look at the track record of designation of cities, it started quite low-key, sometimes not even named one. But now, 2016, they gave about 50 cities. If you look at this exponential growth, I'm a little bit afraid because by 2025, there will be 423 creative cities in the world. And I think this is a kind of representation of how it's becoming a little bit dangerous. So what if everyone is creative? Then, of course, the word creative doesn't mean anything. This is also due to the fact that some people are facilitating the municipalities to make this kind of decision. Someone like Gail Lord, the Lord Cultural Resource, our collaborator actually, but of course they have an amazing, convincing textbook for any government to become a cultural city. So they create a textbook, so every city actually look at the textbook and come up with their cultural planning, which tend to become very similar to each other, which is a kind of dangerous moment. Also in the art world, this is reflected. Change 4. You remember the Bilbao effect. A lot of people, municipalities were spending a lot of money to iconic museums. But somehow the economical decline facilitated this trend to slow down. But instead, my theory is that the municipalities are now spending more on art event rather than architecture, because through the cultural resource soft power, you saw the text called soft power, they are now realizing that spending on event or soft or programming is more worth it than architecture, which is, again, as an architect, alarmed. So as you know, now I did a studio at Colombia. There are 190, almost 200 biennials in the world. So given year 2013 in September, there are 22 biennials happening at the same time. So you can imagine that how biennials start to also mean a little bit obsolete. Of course, there are really good biennials too. And there's even a biennial foundation, there's called World Biennial Forum, but we looked at the attendees, there is no single architect involved. So we thought it was a very dangerous path, given the kind of, basically it's a backlash to the Bilbao effect, and then municipalities are basically moving towards much lighter structure, but much bigger economical effect, which is an art fair. And you know the experience in art fair, which is very kind of no character whatsoever. Sorry, it's a bit. Through this research, we are lucky to recently get a project to do a headquarters for Sotheby's in New York, which is also a really interesting story that now the auction is becoming obsolete model to sell art because of the private sales, but also internet sales. So they're really trying to rethink what their business should be, a kind of multifaceted art entity. So we are lucky to be involved in inventing a new kind of building that is not an auction house, not a museum, not a gallery, not a retail, something a bit more interesting of the combination of those. Change 5, it's a bit of an architectural issue. This is a downtown athletic club. People who read Delirious New York by Rem Koolhaas, you know this building is represented as a future indication of how the building will be used mixed. So this was a stacked different program from lounge to oyster bar to gym to anyway. So this was a representation of how the building, the single mass could be divided into different programs. This is an indication, it's also a very interesting land value model. It looks like a high-rise, but this is basically showing how the land values goes higher towards the center. And of course, the land value is higher, you have to stack the program. So when the urbanization happens, of course, the stacking and mixed use is becoming necessary. But when I'm teaching at universities, actually students and faculty take advantage of this mixed use as if that's a kind of great thing. And then if you have a kind of different colors in section, you're kind of almost okay, you know. So they're really capitalizing on kind of just a mixed as a virtue, but never really harshly investigating what it means. Of course, I'm generalizing. I'm sure you do better. But this is reflected on our business too. This is city of Tokyo, big enough to have, used to have big enough to have a different district with different characters represented by different colors here. If you compare that to, let's say, dinner with your family, it's a kind of a la carte style which you share and have different conversations, etc. But now recently, this is my client, Mori Building, but they recently are finishing many of the big commercial developments, which has exactly the same ingredients of mix, like office to culture, to which is in itself not bad, but imagine this is replicated everywhere. So we call that as a bento box instead of a la carte, so which is a kind of pre-packaged meal that is always housed in a single envelope. And so what used to be kind of animated and kind of different Now it's kind of course I love bento box and I eat bento too, but it's kind of predictable in your experience. So you can imagine as an architect when you're actually designing the skyscraper or big commercial development, if the ingredients doesn't change, of course it's hard to be profoundly providing a different experience, which is not just in Tokyo, but I feel that's happening everywhere. This, I go very fast, but so thinking of that, what we are moving towards as a firm or OMA New York is that this is a project in Jersey City. We know that it's kind of the whole mixed-use thing is coming from a developer's norm of the different program being efficiently stacked onto a single mass. But we thought that maybe we just push that kind of economical drive even further and reverse the thinking. Like the downtown athletic club, it used to be one hermetic volume that houses different programs, but then you always have some loss because a program will be always a little bit inefficient if you housed in a stack. So we thought that we can actually come up with ideal volume based on the norm of the developer first, and then stack them on top of each other like the wooden block. So what happens here is that the building is iconic, but in each block, it's almost like a perfect plan for the developers. And then providing an interesting public space. So it's almost like a stack of existing building on top of each other. It's the one in Jersey City. So the effect on the skyline is quite effective. And then this is the one we are doing in Santa Monica with the same logic, hotel, residential, office, which all looks the same but slightly different based on the norm. So each bar is perfect, but the way we stack is the way to create the iconic gesture. And now, actually, I started to see a building in Tokyo, I'm sure also in other areas in the world, that are stack of different programs and started to actually express the most efficient volume for each program, which I think is the future of, I'm not predicting, but I think it's interesting reverse thinking. Lastly, as it was introduced, I'm teaching at Harvard called Elementary Design, which is also a reaction to this homogeneity that is coming from different direction, art, mixed use, landscape, pressure. I thought that within the three fundamentals of human being, clothing, food, shelter, clothing, fashion, and architecture got yield to the globalization already. Wherever you go, you kind of have a similar experience. But somehow food manages to be very global, but at the same time very, very local, as you know, the terroir culture. So I thought maybe you could, by looking at food, maybe there could be a future thinking for architecture that could be a bit more local, but also global at the same time. As you know, the salt bar, which used actually food itself used to be a currency. This is a long time ago. And as you know, the first globalization expedition happened based on food. This is how the architecture is now. So we thought that the architecture and urbanism can be seen. I'm not trying to redefine the food business, but architecture and urbanism can see through the lens of food and come up with new typologies. Food is diverse. Food is the biggest industry in the world currently. Food is multi-processed, so actually it touches on many different areas of our life. And what's interesting is that a lot of architects actually try to come up with a hybrid model of agriculture and urban condition, like Frank Lloyd Wright. This is called Broadacre City. People had to have actually a bit of agricultural land. And then this is a really interesting drawing which he drew a long time ago, but you can see like almost like a drone flying in these kind of futuristic cars, and a mix of urban condition and agricultural land. But that's actually already happening by default in China. This is an actual picture of urbanization and agricultural land. So you can see the mix of urban condition and the agricultural land, which is really fascinating. I think the agriculture need to come back to the city because of the scarcity of the agricultural land and the food. So, for example, China is doing a joint project with Singapore to make a city entirely dedicated to food production to sustain the population of Singapore. 2011 was the first time that fish was consumed more than beef for the first time in human history. That means the water is now becoming also like the source of food more than ever. This is Hainan in China. People actually living, the fishermen actually lives on the water. A lot of people, architects fantasized on the city on the water like Kenzo Tange, but they never actually had any connection to food source. I think if you actually think of water as a food source, for me this is becoming much more realistic. Food is much also related to mobility. This is the first McDonald's store. It was a car hop place related to mobility. Also, as you know, first supermarket was also related to the car, because you can now buy a big amount of groceries that you can put into a trunk. We used to drive to food. That's why this kind of typology emerged. But now there's a reverse phenomena happening. As you know, food trucks that comes to you. The biggest investment on startups now is the startup domain is that the food-related business, and most of them are trying to redefine the movement of the food in the urban condition, basically to bring food to you rather than you going to the food. One example, Amazon, which used to deliver books, Uber, which now of course delivers people, but both now delivers fresh food. This is Canteen, but Canteen is also an interesting model, which is based on socialist and a kind of totalitarian thinking, but ironically it's used in the most successful capitalist companies like the tech companies. So the canteen becomes like a food, becomes a kind of bond for workers. And this is the marketplace in Rotterdam by MVRDV. Is also housing and market combined. So we think that by bringing back the food to the city, we can actually create, invent, rethink how it could be combined to the current moment. The kitchen is also one of the typology that evolved the most. It used to be in Pompeii, just a kind of subservient room. But as you know, in Glasshouse, kitchen became the social center. But now, because it's a social center in the house, the kitchen are redefined because some people don't cook. So this is a kind of tabletop that can become table or kitchen, as you like. Or this kind of high-tech kitchen. This is a funny one. This is an actual ad from Electrolux, a Swedish company called Global Chef. The title is saying you can have a hologram of your family member or famous chef teaching you the recipe while you're cooking. But look, this person doesn't look like your family member nor a famous chef. So there's a hidden ambition here to also link to Tinder or something. There's a food printer, 3D food printer now. So this is actually a view of 3D food printer. It looks kind of disgusting. So we could help as an architect to design good-looking food now. Can I just end? This is I go very fast. This is a skyscraper I'm doing in Tokyo for Mori Building. The point is that the park, like High Line, is actually going through the center of the building. So we're shifting the core to the side so that the park can go through the center, which is a new Olympic axis, which is for 2020. And then we brought special program to the center of the tower. So this central axis actually represents the new Olympic axis. And then there's a media-related program at the top that has a view to the Imperial Palace. This is the Costume Institute exhibition design we did for the Metropolitan. This was in the Lehman Wing, which we had to do an exhibition in the atrium and the corridor. So we had to create the exhibition space itself. So this is a atrium and a corridor. It wasn't in the gallery. Anna Winter, so she's, as you can see, I have sometimes, I'm not a good presenter sometimes, but anyway, so this is the atrium. So what we decided is to create an inner building with a scheme. So building in the building. So it's almost like a chapel shape because we basically follow the shape of the thing. So we use the scaffolding, really cheap scaffolding as an armature to put this scrim membrane, which could be really stretched, and you can see have different level of transparency. And then we created pochets to actually within a corridor to have exhibition spaces like this. So what used to be like this became like this. And then we integrated the media into the architecture, because my problem in recent fashion exhibition is that you rather see like LED screens than actual garments. So we took all the media out and then only projections that are integrated to the architecture. It's the central dome space where Chanel dresses pattern is projected to the dome as a like Sistine Chapel. And then we designed the gala with the famous, which basically fundraised almost like a year amount of operational money for Costume Institute. One table costs about $300,000. And then we designed that installation, which was interpreted a little bit differently. But anyway, we also designed the red carpet, which was a reflection of that installation with two different colors, which was heavily criticized by the media that it's distracting because it's typically a single color. When I entered, Taylor Swift was the host, so I was seized not to go up, so this is a picture I'm taking. But in the end it worked because there's this kind of central white zone that celebrities somehow naturally kind of stopped for a picture. If it's all red, probably it's a little bit less defined. This is my interpretation of how it went. Okay. I just want to, this is a collaboration with Taryn Simon in Park Avenue Armory, so we work a lot with, so, okay, let's end with this because I want to use this as a segue to have some discussion. So Albright-Knox, as you know, it's a kind of very amazing art collection, amazing site, part of the Delaware Park. Of course, the extension in '62 created a certain level of wall that maybe is an obstacle to connect the city and the university to the park at large. But the museum extension always has been an issue. This is, as you know, Corbu's Eternal Extension Museum. It's like a spiral so that you can extend as long as you want. So it's almost based on the shell. Actually, this system was only built in Japan, in Tokyo. Actually, this is spiral. Of course, there is no room to extend, but anyway. Extension can be autonomous to the old, or competitive, overwhelming, or seamless, MoMA, or subservient. No one actually knows that there was an extension of Guggenheim. And these are some recent museum extensions. Kimball. This is a scale comparisons to, I'm not going to show you the scheme, which I will have a moment. I agreed with the university that I would like to show it to you when we can, again. This is a kind of scale comparison. So you can actually see how Kimball is quite an interesting size to Albright-Knox. This is a zoom towards LACMA extension. This is Renzo's. LACMA's Renzo's pavilion, and this is zoom towards. This is steadily, again, very competitive extension in Amsterdam called Bathtub, but actually have quite a similar size. SF MoMA, that was also a kind of controversial extension because this Mario Botta was extensively remodeled, and I think the connection was not so well established. But anyway, so this is the Mario Botta. So actually you can see how big the 1905 building is. This is our Prada Foundation in Milan. It's about to finish. It's almost already open, but this tower is about to be finished. It's quite big. The Quebec I showed you. My art engagement started from the Whitney extension in 2001. This was my first project that I led, actually, next to the Marcel Breuer's project. We launched the building because this brownstone was protected, so we could only build from the courtyard to have a growing kind of volume. Of course, it was considered grotesque, but we got the approval from board, but the 911 happened, and actually that vote got overturned. So we became a history next to Michael Graves. That was an earlier scheme. But even Renzo Piano, who took over after that, failed in Upper East. That's why they moved to downtown. There's a kind of conspiracy theory that Renzo Piano and OMA is the same office because OMA always starts and Renzo takes over. So this is Albright-Knox. Of course, the dialogue between the two buildings is amazing. There's a careful datum that Bunshaft actually thought of. This is what we found in the archive. It's quite interesting. This is a model of the extension. You can see he still had this stair. And also the entry was not that vestibule, but it's kind of another axis. So he kind of had two axes, which I think is interesting. So I can assure you that this will be gone. That's as much as I can say. And hopefully here too. And hopefully here too. Thank you.
Shohei has agreed to take questions. You can ask him about the Albright-Knox, but I can't promise he'll answer or even be allowed to. But he has promised to come back for that conversation at a later date. But please, questions from the audience?
Yes, I just had a question about I guess you could call them curtains at Milstein. Who did the sketch on that?
Oh, that was a Dutch perspectivist. I forgot the name, I'm sorry. But it's a good point. I didn't explain. It's a very maniac question. But anyway, the curtain, as I said, the view, the whole point of that auditorium is to have a view. But sometimes, like a board meeting, you actually have to enclose it for the privacy reasons. And sorry, just 1 second. And if you close, basically it gives a different perspective by the graphics of the curtain. And one effect is that, as you know, that side has a 48-foot cantilever, but when you close the curtain, there will be columns. That's that kind of joke, but anyway. But the curtain designer is Petra Blaze, Rem's partner. She has an office in Amsterdam called Inside Outside.
My question is, when does architecture overtake the art? The IMP building in Washington was so powerful, they couldn't do much of the art. The question simply is, when you do a museum, Is it the architecture you're showing, or is it the art?
Definitely art. I think that, as I said, the Bilbao effect era, I think architects lost a lot of credibility to the art world because they did, it's, of course, I can't generalize, but some did major museums that are a little bit too egoistic on architecture, for architecture. But I think since that is over and now, as I said, the trend is moving towards more event. I think museum need to regain its credibility of providing public space and more programming. So it's not just static thing, but programming, which is happening in a lot of museums nowadays. So now I think it's coming back. But I think the form and such need to really give inspiration to artists and art exhibitions and curators. So architecture for me is now a little bit, well, not a little bit, of course important, but it can never overwhelm art, I think, especially now in this moment.
Regarding architecture being about capturing change, and that's really a great idea and a great notion. You're doing a very important project in Buffalo right at the time that the city is changing a great deal. It's changed since the time you were selected, to the time that you're here now. So how are you trying to capture the change that you see in the city in your project, and what specific kinds of changes are you trying to capture?
Well, that's why I think the change that I'm describing is a little bit longer time span changes or more significant changes that we are observing, like the status of how art world is changing, how landscape and architecture relationship is changing. Those things will definitely have an effect on Albright-Knox extension, because I think at the moment landscape and architecture can have a really true integration compared to the past. For example, that's capturing the change. So I'm not being cynical that landscape architects are winning urban project, but we think that's a change that architects need to catch up and really implement it. So hence a kind of true integration. And art world, again, like if the iconic museum time is over, what is the iconic place? I think it's programming, it's about the continuity of inside and outside, it's a transparency, a lot of things. So we think, the zeitgeist of museum now is a kind of openness and activation rather than not just pristine art galleries. Of course, that's also important. But so those kind of capturing as you saw the mixed-use development, observing the change is sometimes coming from your little bit gut feeling, or there must be something wrong, or we start that kind of intuitive investigation, cultivation, and use or work with institutions to really verify that your gut feeling. In architecture, as you know, you always need to have a client, but it's always very important to maintain your own initiative to cultivate your interest beyond the commission you have. And in that way, you can always be aware of the change and react to the change.
Hi. So you mentioned that Rem was obviously a mentor of yours. I'm wondering, I'm just looking at things that inspired Rem, Koolhaas in his earlier works, and I'm wondering what projects, writings, or any things that were impressionable to you as you started off in architecture, things that you draw to your foundation that you brought with you to your work through.
Yeah, obviously, Rem himself, because, he's, of course, my, parents' age, but I had the opportunity, privilege to actually interview Venturi and Scott Brown. And I think they are the game changer in the architecture history, from a manifesto-based system where architects had to be genius and, manifest your ideas based on the modernism. But since Venturi, I think it changed to observation. So you try to capture the change, you try to observe the change of the world and then react to it. And I think in my earlier education in undergrad in Japan, I was always told that you have to read this, read that, read philosophy, da da da. And of course you get so confused because you don't have anything to say even before you know the industry. But when I met Rem and when I went to grad school in Holland, I was liberated, like very much, because they're very practical, the pragmatic view of really analyzing the givens and extract the specificity as much as possible. And you don't have to be genius, you just have to sincerely react. And I think that liberated me as an architect. And I don't know even what I'm doing if I didn't have that education, actually.
I'm interested in the chemistry or relationship between client and architect. And I was fortunate enough to attend the interviews for the Albright-Knox, and I was really struck by just the volume of work that you brought to that interview. And I'm wondering if that's typical, or if you took a calculated guess as to how much this particular client was interested in seeing your process, or do you think that that clients choose you because they want to participate to that level?
Very good question. All of the above, but we never really second guess what the client might like. Try not to. Of course, there's some degree of strategy making, but that was a pure reflection of our excitement and the actual process. We are just greedy because we did so much study, so we rather show it. That kind of mentality, not really a kind of sophisticated one. But competition is a very difficult animal, as you know, for architects, because you don't have a face time with client enough to really understand. So the best thing you can do in the competition is to simulate what would be if you were working with the architect. So we wanted to simulate that as much as you can, which is exposing the process to the maximum level. But I have to say the client, Albright-Knox, was smart enough to extract as much as possible from the competition entries. So compliments to them.
I'm interested in your conversation about landscaping taking over architecture, because it begins to make me think about the planning aspect, particularly here, the School of Architecture and Planning. And many of the buildings that you showed were sort of iconic all on their own, as opposed to part of a larger sort of city plan. And I'm interested how you think about planning on a larger scale than a single building when you're sort of putting them in the cityscape as well as the single building.
I think we do a lot of urban planning too, and for me the planning is very similar to programming in the architectural process, where you don't have any preconceived notion of form or volume, but you basically interrogate the condition as much as possible and then create a understanding of the condition as much as possible and start to understand the relationship, etc. So there are many of the programming, which is our strength, our firm's strength too, that because we have this AMO as an entity, a think tank, we try not to have any style of form or material that represents us. Rather, we deny the style, but we embrace the style of thinking rather than style of architecture. And I think that's a way to say that yes, the end product is iconic maybe, but we believe that they're iconic in a very specific way, not iconic in the Frank Gehry sense where it's replicated. But that's also informed by our, as you know, half of our office is still doing a big urban project, not just architecture. So that's also how we get still, careful about delivering architecture, and it's always urban extension of urban thinking that delivers our architecture, I think.
Sure, we have many things to thank you for this evening. One of them is by showing us the Cornell facility. The last two questions came to you by our Director of Campus Planning and by our Provost, and I want to just point out a few facts.
Great.
The Cornell building, as I understand it, was about $1,000 a square foot.
Oh.
And and the building you reside in right now was a renovation, to be sure, but what you see is about $250 a square foot.
Which one?
This one.
This one.
Yeah. And we're about to start the one right next door, boss. Can we split the difference?
Are you saying that we get to do the 1,000 square foot?
Yeah, you bet. There'll be an RFP out soon.
I don't know where you got this 1,000 per square foot. This is a kind of industry.
From your dean.
No, but this is an industry illness that the story from the client side and the architect side is a bit different. So you can choose which one to believe, but it's not 1,000. Depends what you count. Maybe they count their own, I don't know, paychecks. I don't know.
You think maybe he's using that as an opportunity to raise more money?
No, it's a compliment from their side that although it's about, I think it's about 500 something,
yep.
It looks like $1,000 per square foot.
So the truth is, this one actually cost about $500 a foot. Ladies and gentlemen, Shohei Shigematsu.
Thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this evening, and watch our public programs. There's more to come. Thank you.